especially those of you who have traveled from abroad to be with us. Our organizations approach issues from different angles, but all three of us share the goal of leaving the world better than we found it. This afternoon, our three organizations want to give you a sense of where Republicans stand on issues of development and national security. We have a stellar group of panelists to tell us, from members of Congress, a former governor, former cabinet members, and other luminaries. But first, I want to introduce a good friend of mine. She's never been in government, but she has contributed much to this world. Cindy McCain is, of course, a mother. She's raised 4 children. One son is a Navy pilot. Another fought as an enlisted Marine in Afghanistan and Iraq. She also has a daughter, known to many in this hall as an iconoclastic political commentator, and a daughter whom Cindy brought home 2 decades ago from Mother Teresa's orphanage in Bangladesh. Now that, I think you would agree, would be enough of a life's achievement to raise 4 fine kids. But Cindy has also traveled to places like Rwanda and Cambodia and Nicaragua and Sudan to help the ailing through medical care, and as a board member of organizations like the Halo Trust. Cindy likes getting her hands dirty, and she knows what she's talking about. This time last year, having visited one of the poorest villages I've ever been in a war-torn section of the Democratic Republic of Congo, she and I were sitting on the side of a volcano as she described to me the minute differences between Cuban, Russian, and Chinese lines. When the One Campaign and the USGLC and IRI sat down to plan this event, the first thing we all agreed on was that we wanted Cindy involved. All three organizations love and respect her because she's one of us. Cindy, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm deeply humbled to be in the presence of such great minds today on these issues. I'm glad that all of you have chosen to take your time and come here to participate in this. I would like to give a special welcome to our guests from abroad who are with us today, and I also want to commend the One Campaign, U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, and of course the International Republican Institute for coming together to bring us 2 fabulous panels today. Our first panel focuses on the Republican legacy on development issues. As I travel to different countries, I've had the opportunity to see the legacy in Georgia, where we're helping children get involved in civil society. In Mozambique, where the Millennium Challenge Corporation brought clean water to children. To Angola, where Halo Trust brought safety and security with the act of demining and weapons destruction. Now, much of the discussion in Washington these days focuses on budget numbers, as it should be, and we'll hear some of that today. But I want to remind all of you that the decisions we make on aid often mean, and I know this because I've looked into their eyes, the difference between sickness and health, even the difference between a long life and a very slow death. For children, for women, and for men in countries from Haiti to Sudan, from Cambodia to DRC. The connection between budget numbers and hope in children's eyes is all too well understood by a very good friend of mine, Josh Bolten. Josh is our moderator today. He is a board member of the One Campaign and teaches at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. He was Deputy Chief of Staff, Director of the OMB and Director of OMB, pardon me, and then Chief of Staff to President Bush when the administration was giving birth to some innovative aid plans. Josh, thank you for all you do, and thank you for what you will do, and most of all for joining this panel today, and thank you for having me. Welcome.
Privileged to be in such a distinguished company and want to get directly, as quickly as possible, to discussing the issues. about the Republican legacy and the important international development programs. And I'm honored to be on the stage with 4 people who have been intimately involved in those programs. When I served in the Bush White House, as Cindy mentioned, I had the opportunity and the privilege to work on President Bush's PEPFAR program, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. I had a chance to work on his Millennium Challenge program and his President's Malaria Initiative, the PMI program. All cornerstones of a Bush agenda on Africa in particular that most Americans know little about and should know more, because for those of us who served in the Bush administration, I think that is one of the proudest elements of his legacy, and one that endures today. So I'm especially privileged to be here with some folks with whom I had the opportunity to work during the Bush administration on these agenda items, and that will form the focus of the beginning of our discussion. And I will begin with Mike Gerson, who is currently a well-known columnist at the Washington Post, and frequently a wise commentator on TV. He served in the Bush administration as the chief speechwriter for several years, and also as a senior policy advisor. And in that role, he had a great deal to do with the programs that I just mentioned: PEPFAR, PMI, the NCC. Kind of an alphabet soup of development programs, Mike. Tell us a little bit about what was the inspiration for those programs, what was the idea behind them, and especially tell us explain a remark that I've heard you make, that this is not your grandfather's foreign assistance. What changed in the Bush administration?
Well, I think the Republican advocates of foreign assistance need to take seriously that following or during the Cold War, foreign assistance was often not done to get measured outcomes. It was done to reward loyalty, or from European sources, it was done to assuage colonialist guilt. So there was a mixed legacy on foreign assistance that we need to take seriously. But then I watched George W. Bush in the Oval Office when we would have policy time to discuss these programs, drive hard on outcomes, accountability, results. It was his whole approach when we got into the details of these issues. These 3 programs in particular amounted to a kind of ad hoc foreign assistance reform. It'd be great to do global foreign assistance reform, to do it all at once. But each of these programs, in a different way, was reforming our foreign assistance system. We found that scale really matters. The smattering of demonstration programs can't really transform problems. We found that a unified command structure, real leadership in these programs, like Tim Ziemer and Randy Tobias, that matters. To have somebody in charge. And we found that measured outcomes matters. It motivates everyone in the system, and it changes the game when it comes to this. So we wanted to put a certain number of people on treatment. We wanted to reduce the incidence of malaria a certain percentage by a certain time in a certain number of focused countries. That's a different way to do foreign assistance. And there is a moral aspect here that requires you to act. When we by 2000, there were whole countries, particularly on AIDS, that were living in the shadow of death. And I had a friend who was doing small-scale treatment in Lusaka, Zambia. Had his family there, and bring his daughter across town to school every morning to an English language school. It's not a big town, but he had to leave an hour every morning because of the funeral processions that went on all day, every day. That's the situation we faced in these circumstances. But I think it was the president's insight that because it's morally important to do right. It's morally important to do with accountability. And so when we talk about defending foreign assistance, that's why I think the Bush legacy is so important, because it was a different way to do things.
Say a little bit more about the ways in which each of these individual programs was different. Say a word about PEPFAR and the kinds of goals it had, and say a word about the Millennium Challenge and what it was designed to do.
Well, there was a deep boldness on the part of PEPFAR because it had been a major debate in global health circles of whether treatment should be done at all, whether people who already had the disease were beyond hope, and then whether the focus should be exclusively on prevention, because that's where the dollars would make a difference. And that had begun to shift before PEPFAR, Durban and some other places, but this has accelerated that process dramatically, putting a few million people on treatment. There are now over, when the president announced in the 2003 State of the Union address, so I had a little hand in, a paragraph on announcing the PEPFAR program, there were 50,000 people in all of sub-Saharan Africa on treatment at that point. And today there are more than 5 million people. That's due to PEPFAR, due to the Global Fund, due to the contributions of countries themselves in starting to pick up this burden. But treatment was the key to so much else in that program, because I saw all over Africa when I visited how it encouraged testing, how it encouraged people to know their status. There's very little psychological reason to get tested and know your status if there isn't treatment available as a realistic hope. And it changed the whole psychology of countries when it came to this. And so setting specific treatment outcomes, I think, was the genuine innovation of that program. The Millennium Challenge, in a lot of ways, was, and the Monterey Consensus that kind of informed this, was a theory of foreign assistance that said the best kind of foreign assistance is not paternalism, it's partnership. You need willing partners who are going to focus on the things that matter most in order to get serious economic development outcomes. And we're willing to put money, actually significantly increased money, into countries that are willing to come up with their own plans that they're invested in, that make sense, to do things and do fundamental structural reforms like rule of law, women's rights, various democratic indicators. And so we developed a series of requirements, prerequisites, in order to participate in the MCC program. And that was a market-oriented approach that resulted in something called the MCC effect, where countries began to compete with one another because of a limited pot of money to make the reforms that would allow them to receive this kind of funding. I think it's the best type of application of conservative free market ideas, which the president strongly believed in, the task of development assistance, to make strategic investments in people that are willing to be your partner. And that, I think, is a key there. And PMI is just a case that shows sometimes you really do need more centralized approaches on these things. Malaria is fought like a military campaign. You go region by region, you distribute nets, you bring in drugs, you do a variety of things. And we proved that in partnership with these countries, that it was possible to take back whole regions of countries in a very short amount of time. So a country like Rwanda, which we visited on one trip not too long ago with Mike Huckabee and others, they had over 3 years, over 70% reduction in infant mortality from malaria. It's the kind of thing that's a completely unnecessary issue. We know how to fight it. We know how to defeat it. And it takes close to 1 million lives, mainly of children under 5 every year. And it's proof that when you have the right management approach and the right resources, that you can make serious progress against human suffering.
So, accountability and results, market principles applied to development for the first time, a dramatic change in philosophy toward development assistance in Africa. Secretary Condoleezza Rice needs no introduction, I think. She served not only as Secretary of State in the second George W. Bush term, but also as National Security Advisor in the first Bush term, where you had a lot to do with the formation of these programs. It was under your aegis that these programs came together. But let me take you back even a little bit farther and ask you about, if I may, about early conversations you had with President Bush. Because I think even sophisticated Washington observers were surprised at the keen interest that President Bush took in Africa. And you were often credited with having helped trigger that. What did you say to him and how did he react?
Well, anyone who knew President Bush knew that you couldn't say something to him and simply have him react. He was already there about the importance of America being able to show the compassion that is characteristic of our country. I can remember my first conversations with him early in the campaign, Josh, when you were the director for policy on the campaign, about what we might do in foreign policy. And he knew, largely through faith-based communities, of the scourge of AIDS in Africa, and we talked about whether it was possible to do something about AIDS. He was very interested in what could be done to show that America was compassionate about the poorest people. So in an early debate, the second debate, as a matter of fact, with Vice President Al Gore, he was asked about what the United States would do about... about democracy is people do get to say their piece. Sometimes there's do about the world's poorest, and he talked about debt relief for the most heavily indebted countries in that first set of debates, and so he was very much interested in these issues. But I want to go back to something that Mike said. It had to be done in a different way. We all knew that there had been a lot of foreign assistance that had in effect been wasted. We knew, and I think anyone in Congress could attest, that we were losing the consensus about the importance of foreign assistance, that we were losing on both sides of the aisle, but particularly among conservatives, the sense that American taxpayer dollars ought to be used in this way. And so it was extremely important to have not just an argument about compassion, although that was an important argument, but also an argument about effectiveness and what it could mean for us in terms of our own security as well. And I think after September 11th, when we recognized that the most devastating attack to the United States had come from a failed state called Afghanistan that could not control its borders, was brutalizing its own people.
Thank you for your comment. There will be an opportunity later in the program for folks to tweet some questions in.
actually take care of their own people, where you have what we call responsible sovereigns. That is, places that can deliver for their own people, that can fight disease, that can fight poverty, we too will be safer. So there was a national security argument to be made as well. And by the way, a national security argument to be made as well for people living in freedom, which in fact they are now in places like Iraq, thanks to the
Newman has served in more government positions than I think I can name, but very quickly and at a very young age. Connie Newman was the director of the Office of Personnel Management in the Bush administration, on which we're focused right now. She served both as Assistant Secretary of State for Africa and an Assistant Administrator for AID, with very distinguished service in all of those roles. Currently with the Carmen Group. Connie, tell us a little bit about the economic development aspect of all this. Mike is focused on the moral elements, Condi on the national security elements. What were the key economic issues involved in the creation of programs like PEPFAR and CC and PMI?
Well, I think the first thing to say is it's clear that these countries have more money to address their issues as a result of these programs. Under the Bush administration, there was an increase from $1.4 billion to $6 billion just during those years, going solely to Africa. So let's just start out with more money. But I think the best way for me to talk about this is to give an example of one of the countries that benefited from, clearly from the Millennium Challenge, and that's Ghana. And here's the fascinating thing. Between 2010 and 2011, the GNP increases 13.5%. 13.5%. In that same period of time, there was a 20% increase in export between Ghana and the U.S. and 18% import. So here we have a country that was one of the compact countries, Millennium Challenge compact countries. One of the countries that had not the most serious HIV/AIDS problems, but had HIV/AIDS as a concern. Here was a country, though, that met the tests of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, did rule justly. It did insist on investing in its people. It did take seriously that there had to be economic review of economic procedures there. And so Ghana now is a serious trading partner for the United States. But importantly, and I want to follow up on something that the Secretary said, it is a great partner for us in ensuring security around the world. Ghana has one of the strongest military. Ghana is a peacekeeper, has been in over 30 countries, was a peacekeeper in Afghanistan. Ghana has just now gone through a transition of the death of a president and then taking over with the vice president with just a normal procedure. I'm saying all this to say, what is the impact of these programs? The impact is that they're stable. It is making them stable. It's helping them address their serious problems. But from our point of view, they're very good partners. They're good trading partners. They're good partners in ensuring that there's greater security around the world. And they're also friends of ours in the international arena. It's true they're with non-aligned nations most of the time, but that does not mean that they don't vote with the U.S. on issues of great concern concerning the security of the world.
Congresswoman Granger from Fort Worth, serving your 12th term in Congress. Obviously also started at a very young age. And importantly for this discussion, chair of the State Foreign Ops Appropriations Subcommittee, a crucial role in which you've been a terrific champion of some of the programs that we're talking about right now. The last time we saw each other, I think, was early this year. We intersected in Ghana, where you were part of a congressional delegation, looking at I think there were some MCC programs, there was a malaria program there that you looked at. Before I ask you a tougher question, tell the audience a little bit about what you saw, what your impressions were about these programs, and whether with the good theory that our other three panelists have talked about, it looks like these programs are working on the ground.
Well, they are working on the ground. I must say, for a lot of people, thank you, those of you who put this together, because it is so important. There was a sea change in how we're distributing foreign assistance. And part of my job is to maintain that and build on it. Very important. In Ghana, first of all, and we talked about national security and what's happened there, but the quality of life, the infrastructure, the leadership infrastructure is so obvious because these compacts are partnerships. And so instead of saying, we're going to give you money and then you'll expect that every year, so instead, the MCC said, you know, how can we have a compact where accountability, you will take these steps and we'll take these steps, and it really is incredible pride and effectiveness. We're talking about outcomes and results. Absolutely, that's what has bipartisan support. I think part of our job is to tell that story, to make sure that we don't change that original goal of results and outcome, because then we can explain it to audiences like this who are involved, and audiences who don't believe that we should have foreign assistance and maintain that leadership.
All right, let me ask you the tough question now. We're here at the Republican Convention, where the touchstone of this campaign, and indeed the whole Republican Party at this moment, is fiscal responsibility. We simply cannot keep spending as much money as we have been spending. What's the political environment to continue funding programs like PEPFAR and MCC? And what are the arguments that you make to your colleagues, many of whom I'm sure would like nothing better than to have a foreign assistance scalp to take home to the voters?
It's a very different environment, and you're right. There's no one that comes up to me and says, "Kay, I really want to make sure that you spend more on foreign assistance." It doesn't happen. But part of our responsibility in the Congress is to educate and explain and build. And so that's part of it. And I speak to a lot of audiences, and I will often say, you know, what percentage of our spending do you think goes for foreign assistance? And usually the answer is between 20 and 30%. It's 1%. It's 1%. Although one audience, someone said, that's just too much. And so that you can't get around. But we say that's what it is, but it still means you have to use every dollar effectively. Again, it's very important that we keep with results and outcome. But also, part of it is saying sustainability, and be able to say, yes, we support these programs, and yes, they are humanitarian and effective, but we also have to work with that infrastructure of the countries to say, we're helping for right now, and then you'll take over these programs. Sustainability from the countries, from the communities, is just extremely important, so we have to keep saying it and do it. For instance, MCC, if they don't come up for their compact, we have to be able to say, you didn't keep your part of the bargain. In this, we have, in the bills that I've been, since I've been the chairman, we've cut spending each year. But more important than just cuts is to say, is it effective? Do we have any other programs? Can we show the results? Can we show the payback? And our national security, I think all you have to do is look at the cost of instability when we have to come in afterwards, whether it's a national disaster or it's a major military situation. Or do we say, how can we help you provide stability in your country that keeps us all safe? And that's what we have to do, and that's what we have to speak about, educate, and inform.
Andy, you've declined to enter the political arena personally, and you've developed legendary status in foreign policy circles and soon develop them in golf circles. But you're in politics now. I mean, you're at the convention. You're a celebrity at the convention. You've got a big speaking role tonight. So you have an opportunity to address this issue politically with a Republican Party that is, candidly, as Kay points out, skeptical about spending money on this. What are your best arguments, and to whom do you direct them?
Well, I think you have to direct the arguments, first and foremost, to the American people and their sense of what's right in the world. And no one wants to see an AIDS orphan whose parent could have been saved. No one wants to see a woman trafficked into slavery, human slavery. No one wants to see a girl in Afghanistan not to get educated when she might have been and had a better life. And so Americans do have a sense of what's right in the world. But they have to know, too, that we can do something about making the world right. And that's where the arguments about effectiveness come in. It's where the arguments about accountability come in. Americans also want to know that it's going to be to our greater benefit, and I think that the argument that Connie made, who was a wonderful Assistant Secretary for Africa, is absolutely spot on. We would like to, we talk in the United States about welfare not being a permanent status in life. We would like international foreign assistance not to be a permanent status either for countries. And if you can use foreign assistance to help them strengthen their capacity, to strengthen their economies, to educate their populations, they will become net contributors to the international community, and they won't be permanently on the dole. And so foreign assistance shouldn't be forever, but it should be a way to make more responsible sovereigns who can contribute. And I think if you make those arguments in the context of knowing that we know after 9/11 that our fate and the fate of even the poorest countries is inextricably linked, you can say to people, this is a 1% that is well spent, and let's make certain that we're not ceding the field to others. I would make just one other argument in that regard. You know, we all talk a lot about the rise of China, and sometimes I think it's an overstated case because the Chinese have a lot of internal problems. But if you look at one place that China is in fact competing and competing hard, it is for resources throughout the developing world. It is through foreign assistance of a kind that is actually not going to help those countries become responsible sovereigns. I think we have a pretty good consensus, the United States, Europe, Japan, the IMF, the World Bank, that you ought to have countries that are fighting corruption, that you ought to have places that are trying to invest in their people be the recipients of foreign assistance. That is, foreign assistance is a two-way street. In China, with the Chinese, that's not the issue. It's, let me have your resources, and I really will fund this, even if you are a corrupt government in Africa. And so we do have a competitor on that front, and that's an argument that I think also ought to be made.
Connie, let me ask you to come in on that China question, because you spend a lot of time in Africa today. What is your perspective about the role of the Chinese and the competition that we face from the Chinese about which Connie just spoke?
I just came back from the Shanghai Institute speaking to the Chinese about their policies in Africa. And they talk about it in a different way than we see it naturally. They do agree that their aid is without conditions. It's the one condition, which is the recognition of Taiwan. That is almost the only condition they place on their money. But they are now saying that they are not in Africa solely for resources. And as a matter of fact, they are in almost every country, but they are seeking friends. They are there, so they're there for their interests. But the one thing that I think it might be changing somewhat is that they're finding that without some conditions, some check on the resources going in, they're not getting back what they had expected to get back. So the way they're couching it now is, no, we don't have conditions, but we are giving strong suggestions. So I think that, you know, we need to watch this. I do think that the African leaders jumped in. They were very anxious to get this fast money without conditions. Now they're reading the fine print, and they are seeing somewhat of, they've given away too much. And they are now talking at the AU about coming up with a strategy across the continent about dealing with Africa. Whether they do it or not, I don't know, but there are people talking about it.
I guess on that point, I'm really glad that you went to Shanghai to talk to the Chinese about this, because I think they will find that they won't get back what they think they are. But the one condition we know they will never set is governing democratically. And to the degree that we want to see not just an economically more successful world, but a more democratic one, we want that message, and the United States, Europe, and others can send that message.
Okay, how about among your colleagues? Are they concerned about the U.S. ceding influence in Africa to the Chinese, or is that just too far away for it to be of political concern?
They're aware of it. They're aware of it, and there's some conversation. We have so many that came in to Congress running in campaigns about stopping the spending. So you have to get through that hurdle to say, let's talk about spending versus investment versus our position and our national security. And so when you get into those conversations, say, in presenting our bill for the last 2 years, I couched it in terms of our national security. We've talked about that and how important it is for us to be there, whether it's Africa, the Middle East, but we have to also do it with conditions, and we have conditions. For instance, in a changing world today, we were writing a bill with some funding for Egypt, not knowing who we were working with. So you have to write it sort of a little crystal ballish and with a lot of caution, saying, if things should change, here's how we can react to that. So there's this, it's not only a spending situation, but a whole world that's changing significantly.
Mike Gerson, let me ask you to step back a little bit. The agenda we've been talking about that was part of the original Bush legacy was often referred to as a part of compassionate conservatism. And you were not just a key assistant to President Bush in articulating compassionate conservatism. You were key in helping him form that and implement that philosophy. Is compassionate conservatism dead?
Well, at the Ron Paul rally, I think that it was on its last legs there. But I think that the compassionate conservatism, as I always saw it, was simple in a certain way. It was taking conservative and free market ideas and applying them in innovative ways to the job of helping rid people. And so it had a social justice element, an emphasis on the common good, but by using methods that I think were market-oriented and outcome-oriented. And we applied that initially on domestic issues, whether it's education reform or other things. But a key element in that was always that the role of government might be different sometimes. Sometimes the role of government is not to provide services through vast centralized bureaucracies. It's to encourage the provision of services by religious institutions and community institutions and others that have a vast competence in meeting human need. That was part of the theory. It's how can government catalyze efforts of community and private institutions to solve human problems. Foreign assistance, by the way, is one of the best, most consistent evidence of this approach. So people don't realize that much of our money that's provided through USAID and other sources goes to private and religious institutions, indigenous institutions within Africa, local groups, but also American NGOs that have a lot of competence in dealing with refugee issues or dealing with global health issues. And so that, in some ways, is a model. It pre-existed the Bush administration. It's the way things are often done in foreign assistance, and it's very effective when you see it on the ground. And so, I mean, that is a legacy that I think that the Bush administration contributed to. But I think that that's a kind of bipartisan foreign policy legacy on the international side, where it's far less controversial than it sometimes is in American domestic policy when we talk about these things. And so, that to me is a good case for Republicans and more broadly. It's the reason, for example, I'm a fellow at the One Campaign, and we're a meticulously nonpartisan group that deals with these things, but one of the backbones of support for these efforts around the world are religious people and religious institutions in America, from all the way from the left to the right, who understand that we need to play this role in the world, but we also do it in a certain way that I think is very consistent with what we were calling compassionate conservatism. That's encouraging compassionate people to do extraordinary work in the world. So that seems to be a common ground issue. Whether you call it that or not, branding is kind of the different issue, but I think that has a consistent, persistent appeal in the Republican Party and beyond.
Hey, how about the branding of compassionate conservatism? It's gone, dead, buried?
No, I don't think it is. It may be that if you use just those words, but the United States has always been a compassionate nation. And we should never, ever forget that or lose it. And I think, again, when you appeal to that, one of you say, well, we had so much influence on the number of people we're helping provide funds for who are HIV positive, but the difference is what's evolved because of our participation. For instance, the drugs that now can be given to a woman who's pregnant who can deliver a child, even though she has AIDS, deliver a child without AIDS, 98% effective, 98% effective. And so who in the world would say, oh, we shouldn't do that? Because we should let those women have children that are HIV positive and there's no fault of their own. So I think we have to, maybe it's not compassionate conservatism, but it's who we are as Americans, and we mustn't ever lose that.
Hey, do you ever say to your colleagues, how can we let that mother pass on AIDS to her child when we can prevent it with, what does the intervention cost? 20, 30 bucks, something like
Less
that?
than that even. No, the argument I made at the time, that was tall, but one argument I made was we shouldn't assist other nations, and we should cut off every. And I say, what are you going to do about Mexico? Mexico, our neighbor, our southern neighbor, and we help. And I said, for every dollar that we participate, they match it with 12. But don't you want your neighbor to be safe? And don't you want them to be economically healthy and so on? That's usually, if I get through that barrier, you can take the next step of what we're doing with women and children and literally saving lives, millions of lives.
Compassionate conservative?
Well, America's a compassionate country, and we are conservatives. I consider myself a conservative. I see nothing wrong with the phrase, but if people would like to call it something else, I'm perfectly happy with that, as long as we continue to be a country that believes every life is worthy and we act on that. I just want to underscore something Mike said. Some of the best work, really all of the work, I know as Secretary of State and overseeing USAID, Connie will certainly know from her work, couldn't be done without the legions of civil society, of religious faith-based groups that really are the arms of compassion. But if the government can partner with its citizens who want to do that work, why wouldn't we for as it ought to be, not just as it should.
Mike, you've crafted some of the most memorable phrases in politics over the last decade or so. I don't know whether you crafted compassionate conservatism or not. Can you think of another phrase that might help out here?
Well,
Tommy has a point.
Yeah, no, I agree. You've put me on the spot, but I do. You know, for conservatives in particular, some of it is just American leadership. Okay? This is American moral leadership. It's American foreign policy leadership. I think this is very consistent. You know, I know that George Bush made, I think, some remarkable contributions to this, but it's very consistent with the foreign policy of Ronald Reagan that said that both America is a moral beacon in the world, that we have to stand for certain ideals and values, as well as be strong in the world, and our word trusted. And that, you know, that's an enduring appeal that doesn't necessarily depend on you know, how you frame it with a phrase. It's whether America is going to be a leader or not. We saw, you know, I often make the moral argument on this, but we saw, just to reiterate, that ungoverned regions and failed states can originate some of the very worst problems in the world. You know, that's true of human trafficking and drug trafficking and criminal gangs and pandemics and refugee flows and issue after issue. And so I do think it's important to make this case that this is not an altruistic add-on to American foreign policy. This is a centerpiece commitment of American security. At the same time, it reflects American values. And it's the reason it's a great unifying issue. It's just one of those issues where our values and our interests coincide pretty much perfectly. And you can make that case, appeal to both parties, appeal to people of every background. It's a refuge, a kind of respite from the nastiness and pettiness of our current politics. And so I think you should be able to craft a message around that. It's a hopeful thing. It's a uniting thing. And it's, you know, and I think it's a message that when members of Congress know how to carry it, is actually, it's a winning message.
Beautifully stated as always. You didn't capture a two-word phrase, but I like American leadership. I think that that's a message that obviously will resonate well in the Republican Party generally, and it is at the core of what we're talking about here. Condi, I assume you'll be talking about American leadership
I will,
tonight. Do you want to give any other preview of your remarks to this specialized audience?
Well, just to say that I actually will mention the importance of these issues of foreign assistance and compassion, because it is about leadership. You know, we can use the rhetoric of the importance of democracy. We can use the rhetoric of the importance of freedom. But if we can't make a difference in people's lives, then it's very hard to maintain leadership on those issues. I remember very well how we talked about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and he was doing all of these awful things. And then we looked around one day and we said, but why is it that Hugo Chavez has the social justice mission? Why is it that Hugo Chavez is the one who has appropriated the idea of social justice as his own? We know that he is a horrible dictator, and yet he says, we will bring you education and we will bring you food. And people, the least, who have the least favorable circumstances in the world, of course they want to be free. But if you can say to them, you can be free and prosperous, and America will help you be, that is the strongest place from which to lead.
We've come to the end of our hour. I want to give the last word to Kay Granger, because Kay, you are actually on the front lines of this fight basically every day now, with occasional breaks here and there for district work periods. And you're the one that has to, in a very difficult fiscal and political environment, has to try to carry the rationale for some of these crucial programs. Just close us out today just by saying a word about how you think that those outside or on the periphery of today's political process can be most helpful to what you're trying to do.
I think one thing is to be knowledgeable. There are many people who would, if they have the information, will say, yes, I'll be there. We talked about leadership. It's so important. Courage is so important in a day like today. And I say George Bush was courageous when he took the funding for malaria, the funding for HIV/AIDS. That's leadership and courage. And today, we all have to be courageous, and we all have to demand that America be what America's been, and that's the greatest country on the face of the earth. And in doing that, we're both compassionate, we're also responsible, and we can make that, but I think we have to be proud of what we've done, and I'm very proud of the programs that many people in this room and of course, helped develop, and that we keep those, and we keep reminding people that we are making a difference. That's what we have to do.
That's a great final word. Please join me in thanking them.